All right, so we've been learning up until now HTML and using it to like structure the content of our documents. And we keep, I've continually said, hey, just wait until we get to CSS because that's going to be where we actually style and make our things look good. So today we're going to dive in and start learning CSS. We're going to learn some kind of the fundamental structure of CSS, how it's applied as a different type of language. We'll start learning some of the properties that let us control the look and feel of our pages. We're not going to get through all of the CSS stuff today, but we are going to start learning how to interpret and read CSS. So CSS is not relatively new, but like it's a fairly new addition to the web development frame, kind of worldview. In the very early days, 90s and early thousands, we would use HTML tags like the font tag or we would use attributes that were specific to setting up styles. So we would say color equals whatever. But nobody felt really good about having all of our structure and presentation put in one place. And so they came up with this concept called CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, where you can set up a set of rules that match specific elements on the page and apply styles to them, right? So CSS, you can think of it more as like a rules language, right? So whenever it finds an element that matches that rule, it's going to apply all of those, whatever declarations are made inside of that rule. And so CSS is really a fairly simple language in that it has like three main types of structures, right? The first is a selector, which is how we define, does it match this element or not? And if it does, then it goes inside of a block and it says what are the rules we're going to apply to this selector. And those are kind of defined in a colon-based format, so it's going to have a property on the left and a value on the right. Okay, and we're going to take a look at this here in the next slide. But essentially the properties, all of those are things like background color, border, margin, padding. Anything that like can be changed visually is a property. Anything that can be set as a value of that property will be defined on the right. So let's take a look at the anatomy of this thing. So the selector here is the first thing that happens in any CSS rule, right? A selector can be the name of a tag, like it is here, where it says P. It can be an ID, where it says, hashtag, Eric's element. It can be a class, which, if you remember from the other day, is denoted with a dot. So it would be like dot box or dot card, right? That would apply to any element that has the class of card. And then the selector also can be a combination of any of these things all at the same time, right? So you can say P hashtag special paragraph, and it would match every paragraph tag that had the ID of special element. And then, so that's the selector. Immediately following the selector is an open curly bracket, right? So that's this, an open curly bracket. And it's closed by a closed curly bracket. Inside those curly brackets can be any number of CSS rules that are always defined as property, value, semicolon. So the end of the declaration for each one of these values that we want to each one of these properties we want to change ends with a semicolon. And we'll show this off here in a second when we start playing around with it. Okay? Does everyone kind of understand that concept? Okay? And we'll have tons and tons and tons of examples over the next couple of hours. All right, so how would we add CSS to our page, right? There's three major ways, right? We've kind of played with a few different ways, like we've come up here and we said, style, we use a style tag in the header, in the head, and we say any number of properties and any number of CSS rules can be applied in here. This would be known as an internal style sheet, right? So it is a style sheet that exists in this page, okay? And so we can have any number of these types of style sheets in this page, right? We can say, H1, background color green, right? And then we can have a secondary, if we wanted to, we could have another internal style sheet, type equals text/CSS, that has even more rules, right? There's nothing preventing us from having one or more of these internal style sheets in the page. There is another way that we can do things, and this is kind of when you're doing early development, this is a technique I use pretty frequently to just help me prototype the look and feel of what I'm trying to do, and this would be an inline style. So each one of these HTML elements has the option to let us manually define a style using the style attribute. So I can say the style of this is, text decoration underline, right? So I can put a line under this. Each of these rules inside this style equals attribute can be separated with a semicolon. So it's all the same types of valid properties. Us saying h2 style text decoration underline would be the exact same thing as me coming up here and saying, text decoration underline. Okay? Now, the reason you would want to do it here is like if I'm just typing and I'm prototyping my product, let's pull up in this page. Right? So I'm playing with this element right here, and I'm in here coding, right? I don't want to necessarily leave the line I'm at to tweak and fiddle with some styles, right? So I might come in here and say, yeah, the underline looks pretty good. Let's give it a border 1px solid red, right? This is really useful for helping me prototype rapidly and see my changes as I do them, okay? But when you start developing a product like this is the worst possible place to put your actual styles, right? This is not best practice for having your styles. Can anyone think of any reasons why this is not a good idea? Go ahead, Karif.
More of a chance to make mistakes.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you can definitely make some mistakes in here, but there's some structural reasons why this is probably not a good idea for deploying your program. Can you think of what it is? Let's add another H2 in here, right? H2, hello. So I've got another one right below it now.
Ah, it applies the CSS code to all H2s. Huh?
Yeah,
Is
so
that it?
when we're doing these style attributes, this style attribute only operates on the individual element we write it in. Whereas CSS, one of the powerful things about it is that we can apply styles to every element that matches a selector, right? So we can say H2, all of them get text decoration underline, and I can come in here and say, what did I say? Border 1px solid red, right? Perfect, and now you can see both of them have it. So this is really great for prototyping using this style attribute. When you say, hey, I just want to tweak this and get it working right, I want to make sure my margin and padding is right. But as soon as you get this happy, you generally are going to want to be like, okay, this is great. I'm going to go back up here and put it in the right spot. Put it where it belongs. Okay? Generally. There's another major problem with using this. So right now, right, I have text decoration underline. I have border 1px solid red. What if I came up here and I said, hey, for the H2, I want 1px solid purple. Okay? What do you think is going to happen? Any ideas? Knowing that we have these two H2s right here. What color will this border be?
It'll be red, and the other one will adopt the purple.
Yeah, exactly right. Right? Should have picked a color that was easier to see. Let's make it yellow. Right? Oh, yellow's terrible too. Holy moly. Blue. Perfect, blue. Exactly right. So when you're writing code, when you're working on CSS, oftentimes your CSS is going to be defined in a style sheet, and you might spend all this time designing the most beautiful and perfect site, but you might have accidentally left some code in here that is overwriting the style that you have just implemented. This will drive you bonkers, and you'll spend, I have spent at times 20, 30 minutes banging my head against the desk, changing things up here, being like, why is this not changing to blue? Right? I made it blue. Why is it still red? And it's because we left some style attribute in here that we didn't recognize. So this is called inline, and this is called an internal style sheet. There is another method, and this is really the best possible method for most cases, and that is the external style sheet. And the external style sheet does not use the style tag, it uses the link tag. So we'll say link rel equals style sheet, href equals, let's do css style.css, right? And so now, as soon as I bring in this file, you'll notice that my background color changed to green, because that's the same green that we had when we were playing with that very first page we made. Generally what you'll do is you'll have one style sheet or multiple style sheets that define the look and feel of all elements on all of your pages. This is one of the cool things about CSS because these changes are cascading, right? So we can develop our style once and reuse it on each and every single page. This is an external style sheet. Everyone tracking? What is this one called? Go ahead, Olivia.
The inline.
This is internal.
Oh, internal.
And then this one is inline. Another place where you can play with this is, you were asking kind of, Josh, what makes Chrome such a useful browser. There's like a fourth thing you can do, which is you can go into your developer toolbar, and if we inspect one of these elements, right, I'm just going to inspect that one. You have this style tag over here, this style tab. We can put styles in here. They aren't saved anywhere, but we can say background, color, black, color, white, right? And we can see that that has happened in our program. We can also change styles that are applied globally, right? So it's getting the inline block, it's getting the padding left. That was coming from this forms.html page. It's telling you where that style is coming from and how it got there. So you can see that this, when we change element style up here, when we're doing it in our developer toolbar, it's actually setting the style attribute itself. So it's doing inline styles, but it's not changing our source code behind the scenes. Every time I reload this page, that goes away. So that's another way you can prototype, what your styles are going to be without having to actually write code. You can come in here at any element and you can say, hey, border 1px solid blue, right? And we can add a border around our little field set legend. Okay. So this is this is a really excellent tool that you should have at your tool belt. You think of this when you're working on designs, because you can go in here and tweak things without having to actually have it change the code. And then when you get to a point where you're like, hey, that looks pretty good, I like that this legend has a border 1px solid blue. Then you would go in and edit your style sheet and add those rules formally. Legend, one border 1px solid blue. And now all of them, well, I only had one on here, but all of those elements that would match that selector would have that rule applied to it. Cool. All right, so let's look at a couple different types of selectors. So we've talked about, this is like an element selector, right? We're saying, have this match any legend. Have this match any H1. Have this match any H2, right? Well, this is the element level selector. We also have, if we come in here and we say ID equals page title, right? Right? We can do, like I mentioned, an ID level selector. So the ID level selector says page title, right? And we come in here and we can simply say, let's pull up our page so we can look at this, right? That's this HTML forms thing. I can say, background color light blue, okay, and, color red, right? And so that applies specifically to this element, right? This one individual element. You'll notice if I had another H1 in here, right? H1 something else, right? It does not apply to that one because it doesn't have that class. The other H1 is getting this rule, right? So you can have rules that apply based on the selector. Okay, so all of the H1s would get this rule, but then this H1, the one that has an ID of page title, is getting these other rules instead. And if we took a look in here at this element, right, you can see that it's getting that H1, that background color green, and then it strikes through it because there's one that is more important than this. This is called specificity, okay? So generally, the specificity goes from like most generic to least generic. So an ID, as we learned, is like pretty specific to an individual element, right? There can only be one element on this page that matches this rule. Okay, here's another example of specificity and where things get a little bit wonky, right? So we have a page title ID, right? That's more specific than the H1. But if I was to say H1 page title, and I say background color purple, right? This is an even more explicit address for that element, right? And so if I save this, you'll notice the background color instantly changed to purple because I've given it like, think of this as like the full name, right? There's 3 Erics in this class. If I say Eric, which one am I talking about? But if I say Eric Harrison, we know we're talking about me. Specificity is really important, and this is one of the things that is difficult to come to terms with because CSS kind of expects that you're going to be working with lots of CSS rules, maybe spread out across a bunch of different files, right? So which rule takes precedence and which rule is being applied is always a complicated topic, and it's always a little bit of a mystery. There are some rules, and generally the only way to like figure out how things get to be where they are is to look at the element in the inspector, go to the styles tab, and you can read from bottom to top. Like this is reverse specificity. So it's saying H1, this is the default look and feel. This is the user style sheet in your browser. Then it gets the first one, which is H1, which was less specific. Then it gets page title, which says background color light blue, but it's still applied color red. Then it says H1 page title, and that's where it says the background color is purple. So these rules, right, even though this is a less specific selector, it still set the color red because that was not overwritten by this more specific selector. Is everyone kind of following along, tracking? Maybe? So let's see. If I change, let's say I want to come in here and I make the color pink, right? What color will this be now? I saw Karif mutely say pink. And yeah, you're exactly right. Now there is one little like weird caveat. There's a special thing that we can do by marking a rule as super important that will override some of these specificity rules, right? So this is a less specific selector than this one, right? But I can come in here in this color red and I can say not important, right? Exclamation point important. And if I do this, it changes it to red because it says, even if there is something more specific than this, this is the most important rule. It's very easy to get yourself in trouble with this because oftentimes, right, you'll end up going through that same type of procedure where you're saying, why did this rule take effect versus this other rule? And it's because, you know, on line 400 of some style sheet in a different script that you're not even looking at, someone went in there and said, you know, every H1 is supposed to be purple because that's our website's branding. And then the other thing to note is that just because this one says not important also follows the same specificity rules. So if I come in here and I say not important on the color here, right? Now it goes back to being pink. So we've said this is the one that is important, and but then this one also said it was important, and it has higher specificity. So these are like some, yeah, go ahead, Karif.
I'm curious on when would we use this important exclamation important.
I use it all the
if
time.
we don't need it, just one program it will.
Yeah. Lots of scenarios where, like, generally your website has a specific style. Okay, but on a certain page, you want the buttons to be a different color because, you know, like, for example, if you had a button that was like this, and you said, I want all my buttons to have a background color light green. Right? You want all of your buttons to be light green. Do we have a button on here? No, I don't. Let's do input. Right? We want all of our buttons to be this color of green. But on a special page where it's like deleting users or something, you might want to come in here and overwrite that specific rule. So you would come in and say, on this page, you know, I want my buttons to be purple or something, right? So you will do this occasionally. It's just a tool to be aware of, and it's especially important when you're prototyping, when you're doing development. If you're in here changing up some values on here and nothing's working, you can always throw not important on there to see, you know, where should we go. And I will be honest with you, like, ever since we've gotten this kind of development tooling from Google Chrome and from Firefox and some of the other browsers that have this type of style viewer, it's less important than it used to be. Before we had this would be what I'd be looking at. And I'd be looking at the source code and I would say, why the heck is this button green? I thought I just made it blue. Like, I don't know. Real world projects have hundreds and hundreds of style sheets and they have hundreds and hundreds of pages. Trying to like change the color of a button or change the padding or add a border to something can sometimes be frustrating if you do not have this type of modern tooling to help you find out why it's that way. Right? And sometimes you might not want to change your global website style sheet for one specific page. So, you know, yes, I can go in and edit our style sheet to allow me to have this button be the right color, but maybe I still want every button on every other page to be green. I want to make just this one purple. Go ahead, Olivia.
Oh, I was just going to say this literally happened to me today. I could not find the style for a certain button to change because of the global ones. But yeah, it happens and it is frustrating.
Yep. I have spent countless hours over the last 20 years tracking down, like, why is this not looking the way I just literally typed in to make it look? And the answer is, like, there's always a real reason. You can always spend extra time diving into the source code, figuring out, you know, what took precedence, what was the specificity that caused me an issue. But just be aware there is a tool. You can use exclamation point important and tell it, like, hey, this is the most important thing. It doesn't always solve your problems because that other rule might have already had exclamation point important on it. That might be what it caused the problem in the first place. There's another thing to note, right? So we're talking about specificity when we're in here. Right, so let's take pink out. We're going to take out important there. Another level of specificity is the most specificity, like the biggest bang for your buck, is the inline style on the element itself. So if I come in here and I say color green, right? Oh, I put it on the wrong line. Style equals color green. Oh, it didn't work. Oh, because I have not important to find another one, right? This has a higher the style attribute has a higher specificity than any other CSS selector. So putting a style on an element trumps all of these inlines, all of these external style sheets or internal style sheets, with the one exception being the important flag. So if there is an important flag in one of your external style sheets, the only thing that can beat that is if you include important in your inline style. Any questions there? All right, class selectors. So we kind of talked about this, right? So let's say we've got here. Let's make a new page. All right, we got a page here perfectly. We'll use this one. Cool. That is semantic. Let's go to semantic. All right. So this is our. We kind of made a page here with some styles and stuff. These are all element selectors, right? We're selecting based on the tag, but most of the time we're going to want to set up our website in a way that is reusable, especially when we're working with things like divs and elements like that. So we might come in here and we're going to define, let's say, a card element. We're going to say, hey, the background color of every card is F, so like white, and we're going to say it has a border of 1px solid black, and we'll say it's got some padding of 10px, right? And so now anytime we want to use this CSS style on any element, right? We've gone through the trouble of designing something useful and reusable. We can come in here and just say, all right, we've got our article here, that's great, but let's make a card. So we'll say div class equals card. And inside this div, we're going to maybe put a h4, some card title. And then we're going to put a paragraph, and we're going to say, this is some cool text. Okay? So now we have a card, right? And now, anytime we want to change the design of this card for all of the card, all of these elements that we use over and over and over again in our product, we can change one CSS class selector, and it will apply to everything, right? So if I came in here and said, okay, I want there to be some spacing around these cards so it kind of looks rounded, so I'll say margin 20px, and maybe I want to have border radius, maybe we'll do 10. Let's do 10px. Let's see if that makes. Yeah. So now I've made a nice little card that has rounded borders, and I can use this over and over and over again, right? But now I see, hey, this input here, this H4, has a ton of margin around it by default. Right? That's the default margin around an H4 element. But I just want this to apply just to H1s, or excuse me, H4s that are inside my card, right? So by putting a space between these two selectors, it's going to say anytime you find a card class element, and then you find an H4 inside of it, we're going to apply margin, let's say 5px. Yeah, we'll just do 5px all around. Right, so now it's pushed it up. Okay? And we can reuse because we have a card, right? All we have to do is, if we wanted to make another card, right, we can reuse this HTML design over and over and over again. And now we've got a repeatable design element that we can reuse throughout our entire product. Okay? This is one of the biggest reasons to use classes in your elements, in your HTML, because it lets us apply styles that we know we're going to want to repeat, right? And we probably would want to. So I noticed that now that we changed the margin of this H4, I don't know if you can see this, but the T and the S don't line up. That's going to drive me crazy, right? So I'm going to say, let's inspect our element, right? And we can see, okay, this has a margin of 16. And this, so the H4, because we added a margin of 5, is being indented even more. So we probably want to use the same margin in our card, right? So we'll come in here and say card P margin 5px. Okay, and so there you go. Now we're getting even closer to having a really nice looking reusable card element. Then I could say, okay, well this H4 doesn't really stand out as much. So I'm going to come in here and say text decoration underline maybe. And I maybe want to make it font size. Let's do like 1.5. Let's see if that makes it bigger. Yeah, there we go. That's a little too big. Let's go to 1.2. Yeah, cool. So now I've made a reusable design element that anytime I want to use this, I can just write. I can just write div class card, and a div class card by default is going to just give me like a nice little box. And if I choose to put an H4 in it, it's going to have a nice, pleasant design. Card title. And if I have a P, if I have a paragraph tag inside of it, I can put in some cool text. Right? And the cool thing about this is that if I'm using this in my structure, in my HTML itself, at any time in the future, when we change our branding, when we decide we don't like the way our website looks, we can change just a few lines of CSS and have all of these elements reflect that change. If we come in the future and say, we want our paragraph in our cards to have a different background color. So we'll say background color EEE, right? So now it's got like a little bit of gray, right? That doesn't look very good, but you can kind of see the point here, where we can change one rule and have it apply to multiple elements all over the place. Classes are amazing. We talked about specificity, and we kind of talked about nested selectors. So the nested selectors would be like this. We're saying the H4 that is inside the card, right? So it generally goes from biggest to smallest, right? So we could make an even more specific selector by saying any card that exists in the body. The body card, right? So now this has even more specificity. So if I came in here and said, dot card, background color, let's make this yellow, right? And we load our page, right? You'll notice none of these cards actually have a background color of yellow because of that specificity rule we were talking about. This has more of the names of the exact element I'm talking about. So this is a good trick that you can always do to get more explicit, right? We could have also said, the card only is a div, right? A div.card. So any div that has the card class on it gets these rules. I can do the same thing down here, right? Div.card. Now this one takes precedence because they have the same level of specificity, but this one was defined below that one. So if I change this to this, now it goes back to white. So when there's two things that define the same element and they have the same level of specificity, then it goes from top to bottom. If I move this back to the bottom, or move this back below, now it goes back to being yellow. Unless I go in and I say, hey, this is in the body. Because now there's higher specificity. Everyone tracking? Cool. All right. I have to let somebody into this office to do inspection, so we're going to take an early break. Let's come back at 4:40. Cool. Recording. Cool. So in terms of CSS, right, we've been talking about these rules. All of these rules that are contained inside of a single selector are declared inside of what's known as a declaration block. Right. So if you ever hear the term declaration block, it just means the curly brackets after a selector. So if I put in here, H5, right? This is the declaration block. That's where the rules go. And it doesn't, like, white space doesn't matter in here. As long as the rule follows the property, value, semicolon format, right? We could put color, blue, right? We can put them all in one line. We could say color, background color, pink. The structure and style doesn't matter. Right? We can have all of these be compressed, and I'm sure you might have ever seen, one technique that is pretty common for big websites that are used by lots and lots of people is that they will minify their rules to take up less space for transmitting this information to users by compressing everything, taking out all white space. So that's a pretty common technique. But generally, what we want to do with our CSS when we're writing it for ourselves, remember, we're writing code for other people to read and get good at working at. We want to give ourselves some pleasant formatting here. We want to make sure that our selectors are all at the same level of indentation, and that the rules are line by line. Olivia was asking the other day, like, does the order that they're put in matter? And the short answer is no. Though remember that it goes in order of structure. So if I was to come in here, do we even have an H5 in here? Probably not. Let's just add one real quick. H5, some H5, right? And we should expect this to be blue right now, right? It's blue. But just like with the rules, just like with the selectors themselves, it goes in order of top to bottom, right? So if I put color equals red below it, it's going to overwrite the color equals blue in this structure. A lot of people really enjoy putting these in alphabetical order, right? So they'd be like, in this example, background color, then border, then maybe border radius should go next. Margin would go above padding, right? This would be like alphabetical order. And if you're building really big rule sets, like that might be useful to do. It's personal preference. And there's another style that you may or may not see sometimes, right? So let's take a look at our card example as the one to look at, right? So some people like a style, let's take out this one, where selectors that are nested are tabbed in, right? So this is an H4 that is inside of a card, right? So they would come in here and just to visually show this off, they would indent this entire block over to the right. Same with the P, right? So you can see all of these, like this is the main selector that starts the rules that are below it, and then they've indented these other ones an extra tab level. I don't generally get this crazy with my CSS. I like to just keep everything on the same line. But stylistically, they're both accurate, right? There's no difference between the two of them because as you remember, like white space doesn't matter in CSS. Okay. Cool. Any questions about anything we've covered so far? Okay. All right. Another thing that we can do with CSS in our selectors specifically is that we can have multiple selectors apply to multiple types of elements, right? So let's find, right? So H1, for example. Let's give this a background color. Background color magenta. Okay. So all of our H1s are magenta background color. But let's say we wanted to make these rules apply to multiple selectors. The way we would do that is we put a comma, right? So now if we put a comma, we can say we want this to apply to H1s, H2s, H3s, H4s, H5s, H6. Okay? So now you can see all of them get that rule applied to it. But you'll notice it also grabbed the H6, or excuse me, the H4 that we had inside of our card. Right? So we would probably then want to come in here and say, hey, for our card H4, we want the background color to be white. So this rule is a generic rule that is at the selector level, and it applies to all of our headings because we've got them all separated by commas. But then we want to go in and specify that the H4 that is in our card, we want to just overwrite that rule by setting a background color. Okay, so multiple selectors can use a declaration block of rules, and that works with any number of these, right? We could have said, you know, card H4. We can also have this if we ever wanted to use an H3 in here. We could put a comma. We can say this rule will apply to any H3 in a card, or we could say any H2 in a card, or any H5 in a card, right? Now this would drive me crazy because these are out of order, so I'd probably, you know, make it go 2, 3, 4, 5 instead. I would probably fix that up so that that's the way it reads, but it's perfectly valid, right? Either way. So now that we have this defined, we can come into our code and we can say, hey, this gets an H2. This is an important card, right? And the overall rules still apply because we've defined multiple selectors here. So it's going to hit this selector, and if we were to go in and inspect that, right, it's going to highlight, hey, it hit the card H2 rule in this because it's bold. Okay? And it's also getting the H2 from this selector, but those are both struck out because they've been overwritten by something with more specificity. Everyone following? Cool. All right, let's talk about colors. You've seen me use colors in a bunch of different places. We've been using it for background color, borders. There's a whole bunch of different ways to use colors in CSS. The way that I've been doing it most frequently is I'm using what's called named colors. There's a whole bunch of named colors in CSS. You know, you get the basic colors like red, purple, blue, black, right? There's a whole bunch of these, and if you just type a letter, all these numbers are going to pop, all these options are going to pop up with a little box that show you what it could be, right? If we type B, like these are all the ones that start with a B, C, right? But there's only like, I don't know, 256 of these named colors. I don't know what the actual number is. We could probably look that up. But there's not very many of these. Most of the time when we're working with colors in CSS, we're going to want to use either an RGB value or a hexadecimal value, where we can be very explicit in the range of, you know, 16 million colors that are available to us in the web, right? So we can always choose a color that is more precise than one of these colors that is named. So we can, you know, just to show this off, this is a hexadecimal type of format, right? So 000, or more explicitly 000000, right? This is the R, the G, and the B value, right? So this can be 0 to F, right? So 0 to 255, 0 to 255, and 0 to 255, right? So when you combine these together, right, if I, where was our header? Is this even going to show up? No, the header is the entire thing. Let's, where do we make our magenta? We'll look at this one. All right, so it's right there at the top. So, right, 000 is pure black, or 0000 is pure black, right? Think of them in groups of threes, because this just stands for red, green, and blue, right? So if I was to do, right, FFF, for example, right, that's pure white. But if I come in here and I say, you know, this is actually 00, right, it's removing red from this color completely. So what we're left with is kind of like teal, you know, it's a combination of blue and green, fully blue, fully green. And if I was to take out the fully blue, this is going to be pure green, or excuse me, pure blue, because the G is in the middle, RGB. Okay. We also, in Visual Studio Editor here, we have this nice color picker. So you can kind of drag your mouse, you can move sliders around, And you'll see these numbers, this hexadecimal code is changing as we're making these selections, right? So if I wanted, some form of orange, maybe I come in here and I fiddle with it till I get to a spot I like, and then you can see that this shade of orange is E64413. Everyone following along? We also have the ability, all right, so if we wanted to use hexadecimal color codes, it starts with a pound, a hashtag. Then it can either be 3 letters or 6 letters. And the 3 letters it just assumes both letters are the same. So if I do E, it's the exact same as if I wrote EE. Okay, everyone following along with that? We also have the ability, we can say RGB. And RGB is kind of a function, right? So it's a CSS type of function. So it says RGB and then it has parentheses. And what goes in here are numbers, integer numbers between 0 and 255. So we can say 255, comma 255, comma 255. And that is going to be pure white. And 0, 0, 0 is pure black. Right? And now if we use this little color picker, it's going to preserve that we're using the RGB format, but you can kind of see how these numbers are changing are in the RGB column, right? So pure red, right, would be like 25500, and then we can go pure black as 000, pure white as 255, and then we've got all kinds of shades in between there. This is the RGB syntax. All of these different ways of defining a color are doing exactly the same thing. So none of these ways are right or wrong. You're just going to get comfortable with a way of looking at codes. Most of the time when I'm writing CSS for colors, the first thing I jump to is I'm going to use hex codes, right? Because that was the main way to do this way back in the day. And so I just got very familiar with hexadecimal codes, right? So, if I wanted to make something white, I just come in here and I put in FFF. But, a lot of people kind of that are more modern developers who've grown up in recent years, maybe they reach for RGB first as their way of doing this. It's doing the same thing. It's going to set a color regardless. There's no extra special treatment here, but you get a little bit of flexibility here. There's a fourth way, and that is RGBA. And what RGBA means is alpha, right? So if I do let's make this 0, 0, 0, 0, right? So this is pure black, but completely transparent. If I make this 255, it is pure black, but completely opaque, right? So this lets us, when we use RGBA, the fourth option in this function is the transparency or the opacity of this thing, right? So if I did, 160, right? That's going to be kind of transparent. Let's put this as like a 25. Or is this this is a point, right? Oh yeah, there we go. So it's a number between 1, right? 1 is fully opaque, and 0 is fully transparent. So we can do like 0.25 if we're going to be 25% transparent. Okay, that's RGBA. And now if we do this color selector, if we hold this box, you see we get a slider here that drags through those options. Right? So we can pick, a red and decide how transparent we want to make this. We can save our code now, right? You can see it's kind of like a light pink. And this is useful if you're wanting to put elements, like so often what you'll do is maybe we'll have a background image on our body, and we want the header, we want this H1 up here to still have a different look and feel, but we want to know that there's still that image behind there. So that's often what we'll use transparency, alpha transparency for. It lets us do some really cool creative effects. So hexadecimal starts with a pound sign and then has letters and numbers, right? 0 to F. RGB lets us put in a function. RGBA lets us have a fourth parameter that is a transparency value. And then the final thing is named colors. So medium sea green color, medium purple, medium turquoise. Right? These are colors that have names. Any questions about colors? What are the elements that can take a color, right? We've looked at one, background color, right? That's one that has a color. All it cares about is the color. Color itself, this talks about the font, right? So Right now it's black by default, but if I was to come in here and say, hey, this is white, pure F, now all of these headers are white, but you'll notice now that our headers are white here. So you want to make sure that there's enough contrast so that when you're applying rules, that people can read the text, right? So if the background is white, you don't want to probably make your font white. Or if you do, you want to specify special rules that supersede those values. Okay. All right. So color takes it. Another one that takes a color is the border, right? So we can say border dash color if we wanted to say, blue, right? But border color needs us to have a border, 1px solid blue, right? So this is the shorthand, and we're going to learn the shorthand versions of all of these elements when it comes up. But in general, the third argument of the border thing is us setting border color. So us saying that is the same as saying border size or border width. Yeah, 1px, border style, solid. Okay. Just writing border colon with these three values is the shorthand way of saying border width 1px, border style solid, border color blue. Okay. So now you can see all of our H's, H1 through H6 have borders around them. Okay. There are a few others, and we'll learn about these. There's some gradient options that we have available to us that will also take these type of color values. What else will take a color value? Those are the main ones. Like, so anytime you want to use a color, if you want to set a color for a thing, you can use any of those color types, right? So hexadecimal, RGB, RGBA, or a named color. Any questions? Cool. There's a really cool resource called Coolers that has a whole bunch of really nice color palettes put together, right? So this is not the only tool like that, but what it does is it puts together colors that have been found to be pleasing and complementary. So when you're working on styles, I rely heavily on tools like this, and there's a bunch like there. You could search Google for like HTML color palette generator and stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of these types of options. Some designers I know will go to what's the like hardware stores, and you go to the paint section and they have swatches of things put together that are like pleasing room color palettes, and they'll use that for inspiration in their design because there are colors that are very complementary, and there's like some mathematical logic behind it where the colors are on some kind of color triangle. I don't really understand all of it, but the colors that are complementary to each other, if you come up with a palette like this that's pleasing, you can go in and plug in these values in your website and generally make something that looks fairly okay together, right? So if I said I want to select this hexadecimal color here, let's make it our background color, right? Background color, right? We put our hex code, and then let's come in and say, hey, all of our links are going to be this color. Or maybe we make it here, color. You can. Did I change my background color? Here. I got all these other colors that are conflicting. Right, so we can start to build complementary color schemes together. And if I went through and actually designed this from scratch using one of these color palettes, you can generally come up with something that looks pretty decent and pretty good. And then this tool also lets you to we can generate a new one every time I hit spacebar. We're getting a brand new color palette, and so you can use this for inspiration. You can choose, which thing is going to be your primary color, which is going to be your accent color. What you get to pick. So that is coolors.co. Right. And so what I would recommend that is if you are using this tool, for inspiration and design, like if you find a palette that you love, like hey, this palette looks awesome. It has a unique identifier, a unique URL that I would encourage you to just come up and paste this somewhere in a comment in your CSS. Right? So you can say, hey, this is my color scheme. So that anyone coming in after you, anyone coming to do some work and to do some modifications, they can look at your inspiration just by going to this page. Right? And paste it. If I can paste correctly. Did I copy the whole thing? Oh, I don't know. Copy. Right? I can go to this page and it's gonna show me this exact color palette that was our inspiration, right? So maybe you've only used 4 of the 5, but I need a 5th color for like a warning button or something. I can come in here and be like, oh yeah, this Carmine MP would be a great warning button or a delete button, something like that. Something that stands out from the rest of the colors. So it's a good idea. Whenever you're using a resource or you're using something to be inspirational for you, just take a note of the link and put it somewhere. Right? That's always a good idea. Cool. So let's talk about some of these CSS units. There's a whole bunch of units, right? I've been using them, sporadically as we've been kind of playing with some of these selectors that we have, some of these properties that we haven't really explored in depth. But we've been using things like margin, 0. We've been saying, hey, the border width is 1px. The margin left is 50px. There are a whole bunch of different types of CSS units. These are called CSS units. And there are a few that are absolute, right? So the ones that are absolute are things like 1px. So we're saying that the border itself is going to be 1 pixel wide. So let's see if we can find, right? So let's take out these, right? So if I say this border is 1 pixel wide, right? That's what gives us this one single blue line that goes around the screen. If I make this 10 pixels wide, right? Now we got giant borders around here. These are absolute units. But there are other units that are available to us that are relative, right? And so we can come in here and say 1%, right? And now it is so small that it is transparent. Let's make this 5%, see if it shows that. It's not even showing up there. Let's make it 1 rem. Right, good. Perfect. So rem is a unit of measure that is tied to font size, right? So this is really great and useful for mobile, right? So as we build responsive designs, we can define a font at the base level, and then as the screen is being adjusted, we can make it grow and shrink with those things. So let's take a look at all. W3 Schools has a really good overview of this. So let's take a look at that. So we'll say w3schools.com, and we'll go to CSS units. And we'll just go one by one, and I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of each of these units and how you'd want to use them, right? So there are a few absolute types. Pixel by far is probably the one you're going to see most often, especially in simple things like borders. Right, we're saying, hey, I want a 1 pixel wide border around this. I want a 1 pixel wide border underneath this. But you also have inches, millimeters, and centimeters. I don't see this very often. The one place where you might use this would be if you're working on like some kind of product or company that was dealing with real world items that are being expected to be like printed to the page, or you need to be precise to inches, because nobody really thinks of web design in terms of inches, right? We're thinking of it in terms of really like screen heights and viewports and things like that. Points is another thing that is kind of a relic of the past, right? When we used to print things based on like the amount of points in an inch. So those are like, in terms of absolute units, really the only one you're ever probably going to see in the wild is pixels. But then there are a whole bunch of relative measures, and we're going to use these all over the place because they're very useful for letting us build responsive websites. And so I mentioned rem and em, right? So em is a good one because it's relative to the font size of the element. And what that means is that 2em is 2 times the size of the current font, right? So here their example is pretty good, right? The paragraph has, so let's look, right? So this has the paragraph has a calculated line height of 16, 2 times 16 equals 32, right? That's the line height. We're saying it's 2em, okay? But if I change the font size, right? If I change this here to 32, right? It's going to be 32 times 2. So it's going to be 64, and this is going to be huge, right? That's the line height now, is 64 em. And if we were to inspect this in our console, we can look at the computed line height, right? Maybe we can show it in line height. So it's going to show you that the computed line height is 64 pixels. So that when you use em, it is relative to the font size of that specific unit. Okay. Rem is a useful one, which is relative to the font size of the root unit. right? So the root is like your base font size of the page. This one is extremely useful because by simply changing the base font size of the page, you can have every element that uses rem cascade those changes, right? So you can see the root, the HTML selector, right? That's our top level element, has a font size of 16 px. Then we can say, hey, the first div has a font size of 3 times 16, so it's going to be even bigger. Then this top div, that is the outer one, right? Okay, I see what they're doing here. All right, so the font size of top div is 2 rem, but then it has an inner div, right? That is 3 rem. So it is of this HTML, not of the parent, right? So all of these things are really interesting, and we could change this to 2 rem and see, right? So it is ignoring the parent container's font size. So we could change this. If we change this to M instead, right? Now it gets huge because the parent container, that top div here, has a font size of 2M, which is 2 times 16, 32. And then this says 2 times 32, which is 64. So all these changes can make our pages a little bit more dynamic. They can make it so that we can control things by percentages. The other two, especially when we're talking about so a lot of these are like for font sizes and making things bolder or less bold or bigger so that it can scale proportionally with the page size. But the ones that are really useful for layout and structure is VW and VH. VW and VH are for view width and view height, right? So if you wanted, right, if we drag this, because the font size of this H1 is defined as 20 times the view width, okay? As we're on a mobile interface or something like that, right, you can see that this hello gets smaller and smaller or bigger and bigger, right? So by just using this type of CSS property or this type of unit for our CSS properties, we can make our website look great on a big desktop and also still look good on a tiny little mobile phone, right? This is the start of how we start to make web pages responsive so that it looks good on desktops, tablets, on down to, Nokia flip phones or whatever people are using these days. Okay, but be aware that if you have to support older browsers for whatever reason, like this doesn't work on IE8 and below. But hopefully that's less of a problem. So that's VW. View height is the same type of way, right? So as I drag my window up and down, you can see that is based on view height. Any questions about these CSS units? You're going to use these in tons and tons of different places. You'll use them for margins, padding, border, right? So let's take a look with our existing, right? We built this cool card. Oh gosh, I got so many ugly colors in here now. Let's turn all this off. Go ahead, Karif.
Yeah, before you move on, is there inverse to rem?
In what sense?
Instead of the rim doubling the size, it's now it cuts the sizes in half of the font.
Interesting. Let's test. I don't know, but I imagine if there is, it'd probably be some percentage of. So let's.
You'll use percentage.
Yeah, so I would maybe instead of 2m, right? So that's let's make this 32 so we can play with it, right? So it's easier to see. Oh, that's line height. Let's try. Let's do rem. That one was better, right? Perfect. So if I did 0.5, right? It makes it super duper small. So we can always go below, like anything that's like, it's just multiplying, right? So you have to think back to like third grade math or whatever when you learned multiplying by, floating point numbers, right? This would be like half as big. And so if we made this, half as big here, no, let's make this 1. And the same would apply to m, right? Or let's make this 20m, right? That's too big. 5. Cool. So as this element gets smaller, right? So does that element because we're using multiplication, right? Anything greater than 1 is going to make it get bigger. Anything less than 1 is going to make it get smaller. On down to 0. Like if we If we change it to 0, it's going to be multiplied by 0. It's gone. It's invisible. It has 0 size. So, does that answer your question? Cool. All right, cool. So the way we're going to use most of these relative units, for the most part, right? We built this great card, and we said, hey, the margin for this card is 20 pixels, right? That's an absolute unit, and so no matter the size of my screen, it's always going to be 20 pixels, right? But what if I wanted to make it so that as I was shrinking down my monitor, or as I was shrinking down this page, I want this to scale gracefully with my viewport. So I might do something like, 1 view width. Or maybe let's make this multiplicative, right? So you'll notice that the padding between these boxes is also growing as our window gets, right? So we get more compressed, less compressed. Let's make it. Let's really show this off. Right? 4. Right? So you see, there's a lot of spacing between these boxes, but as we get to a smaller phone, it shrinks this up. Now, this is going to make a ton more sense when we start talking about positioning, and we've got like elements nested next to other elements, because that's when these types of scaling and elements getting smaller and bigger really start to multiply, and we really get to get great benefits out of relative units like this. But we have to kind of make up examples to show this off and how they're working, so that you remember in the back of your head, we know how to use relative units, whether it's view width or view height, right? So as the page gets smaller or bigger, right, these elements are compressing. Okay. Cool. Any questions? No? All right, let's cover one more thing and then we'll take a break. So fonts. Right now by default, the default font for most of our computers is probably something like Times New Roman, right? It gives us this kind of nasty looking, like default typewriter looking format. In general, unless otherwise specified, these types of fonts don't look that great on the internet, right? So the default font for all of these things is Times New Roman. So it's the same as if we'd said font, family, Times New Roman, right? So you'll notice that like nothing changed. But in general, when we start talking about web development, one font style that generally looks pretty good is sans serif fonts, right? So it takes away all those little squiggly lines that go at the top and bottom of letters, right? So sans serif looks like this. Serif fonts look like this. Okay? Where they got like little things sticking out on the C, and the L has little daggers off the right. Each one of these fonts is going to be designed, to have a certain look and feel and to capture a certain type of emotion to people who are doing the reading. But in general, like as a super broad rule of thumb, on the web, sans serif fonts usually look better for readability, right? So this is some cool text. Generally looks better if we said, like this. So there's less busy work for your eyes, right? A lot of people, a lot of these rules where sans serif fonts are recommended over others date back to the early days when we were all using those big tube monitors. They're called CRTs, because the pixels weren't precise, right? This is like an HD monitor that I'm looking at. There's no blurring really here, but what used to happen when we were using sans serif fonts like Times New Roman is that it would get blurry, and so the letters would look kind of muddled. So web design in general has evolved to where sans serif fonts are generally the best ones to use. Now, when we select a font family, okay, we have a few different options in here, because not every computer has every type of font on it, right? So if I was to start typing, let's say Verdana, right? Geneva, Tahoma, comma sans serif, we're separating all of our font choices with commas. So we're saying, hey, use any one of these fonts until you find one, and if you don't have any of these three, use this one. Use just whatever is the sans serif font on the computer. So I'm going to save this and we'll see if it changes. I don't know. Yeah, so you'll notice the font changed a little bit. I don't know which one of these we're actually using. I guess we could probably take them out and just see what changes, right, as we go. Okay, that changed. Okay, I don't know if I have Tahoma. Okay, but I have a couple of those because it changed every time we. So it looks like maybe the only one I don't have installed in this computer is maybe Geneva. I don't know what that font is. But we can specify any number of fonts in here that we want. And we say, hey, try this font first, then try this font first, then try this font first. What you'll generally find that is most appealing is you'll want to have some mix of different fonts based on the style. Like you might want your headings to all use some big, bold, strong font, right? And then you want all of your text in your paragraphs to use like a really nice, pleasant, readable font, right? So I might have my website set up like this, right, with these big, bold words, and then I'm going to come into my my tag in here and say font family, I don't know, this, whatever this is. Oh, that looks terrible. Let's use this one, right? This one would be maybe great for all of our H's. What do we got here? Check out font family. And then down here we'll say Georgia. Let's not use that one. Let's use Helvetica. There we go. Cool. So now you can see this looks terrible because of our colors, and this isn't really a great font. But you can see that I've created some visual interesting, something that's visually interesting, where our headings all stand out, and they're different from the pleasant, readable, thin text of our paragraphs. You can spend hours and hours and hours. This is one of those things that like a designer naturally gets. You know, a lot of designers, they even go out and buy fonts so that they have extra things that they can play with when they're working on their designs. And so they'll have a whole bunch of choices in here for things that they, you know, this is the style that we want to invoke when we're creating our pages. Now, there's another cool thing. I don't know if I was going to talk about it. Yeah, let's talk about it now. Google, in their desire to make the website, the internet, a better place, has purchased a bunch of fonts, and they host them for free on Google Fonts. So you can go to fonts.google.com, and you can look at a whole bunch of fonts that you definitely don't have on your computer, most likely. But you can choose one that looks pleasant for what you're trying to do, right? So you can, I'm sure you guys have spent endless hours scrolling through, you know, Microsoft Word fonts, trying to pick the best font to describe, you know, your school paper, or what gave you the most space so you can get away with less words. But you're trying here to pick a font that matches the style you're trying to go for. But what is really cool about these Google fonts is that we can embed these in our web page very simply, right? So we can say, hey, I want to make this font available to anyone who visits my web page, even if I don't. Let's pick one that's really distinct, right? So I'm going to say I want to use this font. I can grab this link HTML from our page and just include it, right, by simply pasting it in here. Right? I can say, hey, give me these fonts. Right? It's just a style sheet, right? So we're grabbing these style sheets from Google, and then when we want to use it in our code, right, I can come in here and say, hey, the font family down here is let's use it on our H1s. Not this one. Perfect. So when we view our page now, right, I've got these cursive fonts that I got from Google that were loaded by a style sheet. Right? If we were to actually go to this, and we can look at this, this is the actual style sheet that is being loaded into our computer, right? It's a whole bunch of CSS commands that say, hey, the font for this is pulling in from this font file. And so this is being included as a style sheet on our page so that we can use these fonts in our product, right? With all the different weights and heights and sizes so that our web application can use a font that we that best describes the structure that we're trying to do. So Google Font is an excellent tool, and you should definitely keep this in mind when you're doing design work. If for no other reason, like most of the time, your paragraphs and things like that, you know, you can pretty much rely on the system fonts, the ones that are installed by default on everyone's computer, to do a pretty good job 99% of the time. But when you're talking about headings or like your site title or a major, you know, you want something to spice up some of your headings, Google Fonts is a really good way to go in and pick a font that really matches the strength of the content and it matches the design and feeling you're trying to evoke in your product. Okay? And you can always just browse through here looking for inspiration, right? this one is called gluten, and if I was making like a bakery website or something, like maybe something cutesy like this would look good. Or maybe this is I'm making a website for, like K through 5, 5th grade education. Like this is like a cutesy option that is not like Comic Sans or one of those other like notoriously crappy crappy fonts. So you might pick something like this. Any questions about Google Fonts? You know how to use this? Go ahead, Olivia.
So what if the font is not a Google font, but you have to use the font because it's like following a brand of a big company? Like say Toyota has their own font, but it's not. Do you just tell them no, or?
Nope. It's extremely easy to do this now with CSS. It did not used to be the case, but the way that Google is doing it, if you go check out this code, right? As long as you have a font file, then you can define your own font face. You can say at font face, this is a CSS selector, and it's a magic one. It doesn't actually change. Like you'll notice there's no font face element, but by putting this at sign in here, it's saying, hey, the name of this font face is Bon Hur Royale. So in your case, you could be like the font face is called Toyota, and the font style is normal. You're going to have to define all of these for the different heights and widths, right? So the font weight, that's the boldness, right? So as it goes from small to like, if you take a look, right, this is thin 100 all the way up to block 900. So whatever fonts are available in your font file that you're provided by the client, you're going to have to make an at font face declaration to support it, and you'll say, hey, the name is this, the style is normal, the font weight is this, and then you can define a Unicode range that it supports, right? So if it's every letter in the Unicode like most font files really just support like ASCII English, so A through Z, uppercase and lowercase, plus all the special characters like exclamation point and stuff. But if you're supporting Chinese characters or any of these other things, you're going to have to define what characters you're supporting in Unicode. It's kind of complicated, but there's probably a website as well or a resource that walks you through this or generates this file for you if you upload a font to it, so that it can just I'm sure there is like a web font CSS generator would be maybe what I'd look for. Yeah, there we go. So if you upload one of those files, like a font file, right, this will generate that CSS for you, so that you can just include that on your page. And then any place you want to use that font face, right? If you were doing, if you had uploaded the Toyota font, you just put Toyota here.
And so you wouldn't run into the issue of someone that doesn't have it loaded on their computer? Would it still show up?
No.
Or
it would work in most cases, and the most cases is because you've included this CSS. It says when you get to an element that says use the Toyota font, CSS inside the browser says, oh, I know what that is because I downloaded this file and I used it here and I named it Toyota. Now the caveat being, and the reason you should always have a fallback here like comma cursive or comma sans serif, is some networks, especially in big companies, Fortune 500 companies, will have their firewalls block font downloads. Right? So your browser's going to say, hey, I need to fetch this font resource, and the network itself will say, no, thank you. And so the browser has no idea of knowing that there was no, to the browser's perspective, I tried to download a file and it wasn't there, so I'm going to default to the next option on the list.
Okay, cool.
You can't ever guarantee it. If you need to guarantee that your font will show up as you expect it to, the only way you can do that is by putting that text in an image and embedding the image in the page. But there are some companies that block images as well, so.
Okay, cool. Good to know.
Nothing is guaranteed in the web game.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Any other questions? Sorry? Oh, Eric, go ahead.
Man, I'm trying to follow along and understand this stuff, but I'm just wondering, like, so front end designers, they really just like spend all day like going line by line and like writing like RGBA, whatever for each individual element. I mean, I know you can do them in groups, and you can like style every element of a certain type on the page, and you can style individual ones. But I guess what I don't understand is like what sort of like how do they choose this stuff? Like, what's the difference between like RGBA 212.7.7 versus RGBA 213.6.6, you know, or like why does there seem to be like infinite customization? Like, are we expected to know and remember all of this stuff?
Um, you're expected to know how to do it. Are you expected to be a good designer? The answer is you can make a very healthy career of 20 plus years being terrible at design. Like, this ugly nonsense right here is about the level of stuff that I make when I have to design something. There are types of people in the world, right? These are the people that go to Savannah College of Art and Design, or whatever, right? SCAD, or they go to art school, right? Where they think and create emotionally art products, right? Designers, people that are, that love living in, the difference between cornflower blue and light baby blue, right? Because it invokes different emotional responses. If you're the type of person that is artistic, you might love this type of work where you spend all day tweaking the minutia of, what does 212 versus 214 look like? Not much of a difference, but they're going to tweak this until it's exactly perfect because they love it, right? Coke has a very specific color of red that is the Coke red, right? So if you're building a product for Coke, you're going to use their color. You don't have to think about it. You're going to spit in Coke's hexadecimal, like, let's say Coca-Cola red hex code, right? So Coke red is 24400 or F4009, right? So if I wanted to make Coca-Cola red here, I could do F40009, right? That's Coke's official red color, right? And so if I was making, let's say color, we'll do white, right? And hey, we already have cursive here, nice, right? So, what? No, because we have it. Let's take out all this other stuff. Okay, cool. Where are we at here? Header. Right. So if I said Coca-Cola, right? Hey, now we're close to being like on Coke's branding. So the short answer is people that love doing design, doing front end stuff, love living in here and caring about the minute details between one color shade and another color shade and how many pixels go here and how many pixels go there. I like functionality. I'm a back-end guy by heart. I like working in databases. I like making buttons do things when you click them. So I spend almost all my time and energy on the back end. But I always have to know CSS and I have to know HTML because that's what I'm adding functionality to. So being well-rounded enough to know that if you've got a designer on your team, he's going to give you a CSS file. How do you implement that CSS file? Do you know the right tag to put that on your page? Do you know how to, when you're adding new buttons, do you know how to go in and change things a little bit if you need to? You have to know all this stuff. Most of you will probably get jobs as what's basically like a full stack position. So you have to know a little bit of front end and a little bit of back end. Most of the time, with the exception of like when you're working on projects for yourself or when you're starting a company, you're going to be going into a team that already has a product. And they're already just going to say like, hey, we need you to fix this bug. Go in here and fix the bug. You'll be working in like 8 lines of code. And then they're going to, as you get a little bit more advanced in your career, they're going to ask you to build a new feature. And so you might have to build a new page, but it's going to exist within the framework and template of what has already been built for that company. So you're very rarely going to be starting from scratch with nothing there but a blank page, with the exception of if you're building something new for yourself or you're building something for if you're starting a new company. And even me, when I start a new company, I go grab a pre-built template and I start making it do things, right? Like Docket, which is my Docket. Right, this is my company. Like this is a pre-built template. It looks good because somebody that's good at design made this for me. Like I don't know. I don't have to do anything. But I make it so that when I log in here, it actually submits information and has customer information and things like that. So I care about functionality. I don't care about design. But I hire the heck out of people who love design because they make our products look better. So it's up to you what kind of developer you want to be. Any question? Yeah, Josh?
When you say you downloaded a template, you're not talking about WordPress, are you?
Nope.
So what is like a pre-built template then?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of websites, right? So you can go to like HTML5 up, where they've got like designs, and so some of these are free, some of them are premium, right? And it's an entire website built to let you just write code, right? So you can click a live demo here. And, you know, if you're building a type of portfolio page or something like this, this might be a good way to go. Let's see, HTML5 admin template. Right? So most of the time, I'm going to use like an admin type of template or an admin dashboard because they have so much functionality built in the template that I can build a company or a product around any of these types of designs, right? And so let's take a look at something like this. Demo. Let's take out that. Right, so you get just an HTML page behind the scenes. It's clean HTML code, right? They spent a lot of time making this look nice, and they spent a lot of time making things have like little animations and tying in. But they have a whole bunch of different layouts and stuff so that it gives you like a starting point to add functionality. Right? They give you a bunch of different styles. So all you're really doing is going in and just using the styles and the classes that they've written for that design. This would be like me having a full-time front-end designer developer on my team. And I said, hey, spend 6 months making our website look good, and then I'm going to come in after the fact and make it actually do stuff. So buying a template is just like not hiring a front-end developer. I just get the end result. And then I'll go through there and I'll put my logo in up here, and I'll take out anything I don't need. I don't need different language choices, right? I'll take it out. Whatever this is, I don't need that real-time users thing. I'll take that out too. But it's got all the stuff you need to build like a full-featured product without needing to hire a full-time designer. So that's what I would do. But you still, even when you're in here working, I still need to know, how to use classes, how to edit them to fit my company's branding guidelines, right? Like, I don't want everything to be white, right? So maybe I want to, if we have a color, I'm going to put our color in this header. So this color has the docket color is like a light blue, so I'm going to switch to that. Does that make sense? So you still have to know enough CSS to be able to change things and make it reflect what you're trying to go for. But you can start from this kind of jumping off point where they've got a bunch of stuff kind of pre-built for you. It's got like a nice looking login page, so you can imagine all I got to do is change out this background image, swap in my logo, and now I've got a page that's ready to go, and all I have to do is worry about actually the hard part, which is logging in, checking user credentials and taking you to a page. But the HTML that's behind here is just, you guys could write this if you wanted to, but this is going to take you 2 days, 3 days if you're not a design-loving person. And there's CSS here. This is an example of a realistic CSS file from a real project. These get huge, right? Because you have to account for the design of each and every type of asset that you want to include in your product. And they've even pulled in some stuff here that has been minimized, like we were talking about, to save some space. Any questions? No? All right. It is 5:30. Let's take a break. Let's take a longer break this time and come back at 5:47. Recording. So we've learned how to change the font itself, change it to a different type of font. We've learned how to embed fonts from Google and from other places, and in the example that Olivia had, if you've got a customer that has a specific font that they've designed and spent money on, we've also kind of learned how to embed that if we needed to, or at least know where to go search and start looking. But there are other things that we do There are other properties in CSS that specifically talk about fonts, and we're going to show a few of those off here. So where's our code? Where's our page? Oh no, it's gone. 127.0.0. What am I on? Elements? No, that's not it. Semantic. We're on semantic. Cool. Right. So we have these. Right. We have these H4s, H2s, H whatevers. The first one that we want to look at is font size, right? By default, if we don't put a font size in here, it's going to use, it's going to cascade. Well, let's make it a color so we can see it. Color, black, right? Good. So by default, if we inspect this element, right, and we look at how does it get its font size, right? It's getting that from, generally, if we haven't defined any sizes anywhere, it's getting it from the default style, right? So this H2 is going to have a bigger font size than the H4 that we're using here, right? We looked at that the other day. But we can define a font size here by using the font-size, and we can either put in any of those CSS units that we were looking at earlier today, right? So we can put in pixels, we can say 16px, and so now all of these are the same font size, or we can have it be relative to the font size of the unit, right? So we can use, 2 EM, right? Or we can use relative to the font size of the parent unit, right? Which is the rem, right? So that's going to be the same because the parent unit, we've never defined, like let's define this up here. Font size 16px. So we're going to say this is our base font size. Or let's do it in HTML so it's even more clear. HTML font size 16px, right? So we're defining a base font size. So we have those options available to us. We can also use those other units that we said, hey, we don't really see a use for these, right? There was like 1 IN, right? 1 inch, right? Now these are huge fonts. Each one of these letters is an inch. And if I took a measuring tape up to my monitor, this is probably going to be 1 inch across, okay? And we can also do smaller than an inch, right? We can do 0.5 inches, right? So half an inch or 0.25, right? All of the types of units that we have available to us in CSS, in the CSS units that we were looking at earlier, are available to us here as options, right? We can even put percentages in here. We can say, 25%, right? Or we can say 50%, right? Those are relative to what it would have been in the first place. If we say 100%, right, that's going to be, if we inspect here and we look at this, right, the font size is 100%. If we look at our computed style, the font size is 16px. So 100% of the base font size. Does that make sense? That's the same, it's the same as using, 1 rem, right? That's going to be 1 times 16 pixels, so 16 pixels. If we did 200%, right, that would be like 2 times, that's 2 rem, 2 times 16 pixels. Okay? So any of those units that we want to use can be used in here. If we want to make this bigger, right, 32 pixels, we can manually type this in. But the problem is now this is fixed. So if we ever change our HTML font size, which we're going to learn how to do with media queries when we start making things more responsive on purpose, this would still be hard-coded to be 32 pixels, whereas if we did 2 rem, for example, it's still 32 pixels, but now if I ever change my, change my font size so that I'm on a mobile device, right, this has gracefully scaled down with that change in size. So, that's font size. We also have a whole bunch of other things we can do to fonts, right? And we've seen one of them. It doesn't have the font prefix like the rest of them do, but it is a text decoration, right? And inside of text decoration, we have a whole bunch of options like underline, okay? We also have strike. What else do we have? Text decoration. Let's look this up on W3 School so we can see all of our examples. A lot of these CSS properties, there's a bunch of stuff that you can do. Most of the time, you're going to use it for like one thing. So text decoration is how you make things underlined. But let's look at if there are other examples. Text decoration properties. So what I do when I need to reference some of these properties, I'm going to go specifically to W3 Schools, type in the name of the property, and just see, so line through, right? Text decoration line through is going to do what what our strike tag was doing for us, right? So we can apply the style of striking something through without having to wrap it in a strike tag. Okay, and if we needed to use two things at once, the text decoration option lets us put a space here, and we can say line through and underline. So we got both of them here at the same time. What else can we do? There's an overline, just like underline. Overline. Ooh, I typoed it here. Which does exactly what you'd expect. Now there's a top and bottom of this text. Right? And we can do any number of these things in conjunction. Now, generally, I have never in my entire life of 20 years used any of these other ones except text decoration underline. If I need to strike something through, I'm almost always going to wrap it in a strike or wrap it in a delete, right? Because I want it to appear struck through. I've never needed to like decorate my text to have a strike. That doesn't make any sense. But it's there as an option. And that's how that element, the delete element or the strike element, if we were to look at like the behind the scenes CSS that the browser is doing, by default it's using text decoration line through. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's where are we at here? Oh, here we go. Right. So what else can we do with fonts? We can also do a font weight, right? So right now, by default, this is bold, right? Because it's an H element, right? It's an H4, so it has a default style that has it have a like a boldness to it. But if I change font weight to normal, then it's going to behave as if it was not bold. We can also do font weight bold, okay? And then we can also do font weight bolder, which is going to make it even thicker if the font has that option. Do you remember when we were looking at the Google fonts? I closed it. Font. Right? With each of these styles, it was showing you that it had a light version, a medium. This is like a normal. Then it has a bold, and then there's an extra bold, right? So all of those are options. So we can say bolder, extra. We can even type this in. We can say font weight 800 and see what that does. This font might not have all those options. 200? Yeah. So however many options this font has declared in its font file, we can define those as a font weight. So let's look this up at W3 Schools because I'll show you a couple different options here as well. So font weight. And we can just click on the property. So there's a bold, normal, and then they show you the, if that font has defined a couple of different integer values between 0 and 900 usually, then you can, it defines the thickness of the characters, right? 100 through 900. We also have the ability to have it be set to its initial value. So if there was something that was a default and we wanted to just override whatever style was being applied to it from somewhere else, we can say set it to initial, or we can tell it to inherit whatever the font weight is of the parent element. A lot of these stylistic elements will have an inherit property that says, hey, I just want to do whatever my parent container is doing. So that's an option here as well. Okay, what else can we do with fonts? We did font weight, we did text decoration, font size, font style. This is going to let us, if we just press colon, you'll notice it brings in a drop down. Italic will make this italicized. Normal is the normal font. Oblique, I think it makes it like backwards. Let's look. Or it like does it the other way. Yeah, so it kind of stretches it, like it puts it at a slant. Or if we change this to normal, right? And if we change it to italic, it makes it actually italicized. So oblique, maybe we could show it off on a P. It might be easier to see down here. Font, style, oblique. Right? It's kind of slanting the text, and it should be a little bit different than italic. So if you just, okay. So in this case, this font, oblique and italic are synonyms, but that's not. So it relies on the font itself to have a designed version that registers as oblique. So you'd have to have picked a font family that has a different oblique option. So each one of those, but generally, just like with everything else, whenever you use font style, 99% of the time, I'm going to either just use italic or normal. Like, the text is normal by default, unless I'm inside of an EM tag, right? And so, If I want to make something italic, but I haven't put an EM tag around it, then I'm going to use font style italic. If for some reason I wanted to make an emphasized block of text normal, then I would use font size normal. Excuse me, I had to sneeze. Does that make sense? And then we also have this. I'll have to add some changes to our code here so we can show this off. Like this is some cool text. I love large paragraphs. This is a lot of fun. I hope I have typed enough words by now. This next part makes sense. Let's see if we got multiple lines here. Okay, perfect. So, if we wanted to change the line height, the spacing of these lines on this this page, we can do line height, and we can put in any one of those units, right? So if I say 12px, right, you should see that the spacing between these two sentences gets a little bit bigger, or a little bit smaller apparently, because the default, I think, is whatever your font size is, right? So if we made this, if we wanted to have even more breathing room between these two lines, we can make it something big, 32px. So it said that the height of this line is bigger, right? Designers love this kind of thing because they have spent, you know, we were talking about why designers go in here and spend all this time fiddling with stuff. You know, they'll cite readability studies where they've said the optimal line height for readability for a person to not have eye strain is this, and they'll pick that. And so based on their font selection and their font size and the design guidelines of the company, they'll go in here and they'll spend hours fiddling with these numbers, trying to get it to just be the perfect amount of white space separating lines. Okay, I have, like, this is a true story. I have watched a coworker spend 4 hours tweaking line height values on one CSS selector to get it to look how he wanted it to look, and he would change everything. He'd change line height to 30, and then he would change margin to 6, right? Just trying to get the feeling and the flow of the letters to be correct. Okay, that's the kind of obsessiveness that designers have for this type of work. For me, most of the time, I just leave this default, and whatever the default browser setting is most of the time good enough for me. But sometimes, if I do feel like I need a little bit of extra love, I will come in here and say line height, and I'll maybe make it like 125% or something, just to stretch things out a little bit, right? So you're going to get a good sense of, if your page starts to feel really cluttered or really tight, or it's got a lot of text content in there, you'll get a feeling for what things you want to change and experiment with to change the readability of your fonts and things. Okay. Cool. That covers most of those. So we've played with a few of these over the last couple days. Height and width. So we've been talking about the difference between a block level element and an inline element. We learned that block level elements by default have a value, right? So let's take one of our cards, for example, right? So our card, we said it has a margin of 4 view height, right? That's what's giving it. But you'll notice that this div, because it is a block level element, is taking up as much space as it can. It's going to go all the way to the left and the right. And the only reason it doesn't go to the very far edge is because we intentionally set a margin in here. We're going to learn about margin here in a bit. But in general, block level elements have access to a couple of special properties that let us specify how big they can be, right? And the first is, let's say width, right? So if I say width 50%, right, we can use any CSS unit, any of our units in here. So I'm going to say 50%, and now you'll see that they take up 50% of the page, right? I can do the same with, because we can use any CSS unit here, I could also say, let's make this, 500 pixels, right? Now it's a little bit bigger. Or I can say, 0.5 view width, right? Wait, what? Oh, 1 view width? Wait, what did I do here? I don't know what's going on. I have to play with this and figure out what's going on. But we can use any of our CSS units here to define the size of these elements, right? So as you'd imagine with width and also height, right, we can say, I want this to take up 50% height, okay? But by default, height is a special one because it's controlled by the size of the content of this page, of the box, right? So it has to have at least, so we can hard code this. Let's say 250 pixels. Right? Oh, took it out completely. Right? So now we've said, hey, I want you to ignore the fact that you were being relative, and I want you to be a specific size that I define. This only works in the two types of elements that are either block, or if it was a span element and we wanted to set a width, right, we would have to change this to inline block if we wanted to make it work on spans and some, a button, any of those things. Height and width only work when it's either block or inline block. Okay? Any questions about that? So you'll notice we've been playing with like a concept of like a card. This is a pretty common design element that you're going to probably see time and time again because it's a really useful like design metaphor for a lot of modern development, right? So if you go to Pinterest, they kind of talk about these as like a little pin, right? But that pin behind the scenes is some kind of concept like this where you've got a wrapper that is a card and they set a height and a width and they say there's going to be an image at the top of this and there's going to be some tags and descriptions down here. So you're going to see this kind of card language used pretty frequently in development. It doesn't mean anything special. It's just an agreed set of terminology where people are saying, we're going to have some kind of thing that stands out from the page, so we're going to have a whole bunch of these elements, and we're going to reuse them over and over and over again. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, I've seen some companies that will name this like section, right, or like a panel, right? It's the same thing, right? It's whatever you want to call it. But generally, if you use the word card here, people understand that you mean some kind of like reusable block that you're going to move around the page that is smaller than the page itself. Okay, height and width, we covered that. By default, the height and width of any element, if we don't set it, if it's a div, is auto, right? And what auto is doing is all that magic that happens automatically, right? It's saying take up as much space to left and right as you possibly can and have a height that is just big enough to contain the content of our box, right? So if we've got, this, for example, if we look at the card itself, right, the card has an H4 in it and a paragraph in it, and it has some padding, right? It has some padding. If we hover over this little computed style box, it shows you on the screen, like it will show you where that padding actually is. So the auto value for a block level element is only ever going to be the size of the contents of this box plus the padding. Then there's a border, right, which in this case is 1 pixel wide, and then a margin. Right? This is the entirety of this element is those 4 things. Margin is the most exterior. But we kind of had this question in our HTML thing about the cell padding. The padding is always the internal spacing inside of the border. Now, height and width, auto is the default value. If you set auto, you're at least at where it was as if you didn't have a height and width at all. Right? If we take this out, right, it's the exact same thing. But if you want to override something, right, if you want to say the height is going to be, 200 pixels tall, right? Now we've forced it to be a box that conforms to our height. We're saying every one of these is going to be 200 pixels tall, even if the content inside of it is smaller. And so if we were to look at this, if we were to look at this element now, you can see it still has, select the wrong element. You can still see it still has the same margin, still has the same border, it still has the same padding, but now the contents are 694 times 200. So the height is 200 because we set it to be 200. Now there's a danger here in that if we have some content in our, let's go find this top one, right? We'll just put in Orem, oh, the heck? Orem 5000, right? We make this really big. Okay, great. You can see we set the height to be a certain height, and the contents have now overflown that. Whereas if we left the height to be auto, we change this back to auto here. Where's that? Auto. Now that first box is going to scale gracefully all the way down, and the rest of them are going to, gosh, we too much text here. I overdid it, I think. The other ones are smaller. So height is one of those weird ones. You gotta be careful with it. Width is one you'll change probably more often. Let's take out some of this lorem text because that's gonna drive me crazy. Good. Right, back to small. But width, generally, we're gonna use divs and structural elements like this all the time to lay out our pages and lay out our websites and structures. So you'll come in here and you'll say something like width, 200px, and that will be your card thing. And then maybe all of these float to the left. Right? We'll talk about floating. Right? So you'll have let's put in a clear. Right? So you'll have cards that can expand and contract to fit our page. Right? So we'll learn about floating and how to position these elements a little bit later, but this only happened because we set a width of a thing that was supposed to take up full width, and then we're doing something to position it next to other things. So this is, we were talking about doing tables before, way back in the dark ages, where we'd set up a big table and we'd say, all the cells in the far left are our navigation elements, all the cells at the top are our heading elements, and then everything in the middle is our content. Well, now we do things with divs and other types of HTML block level elements, and we're going to position them around the page just using CSS rules and CSS properties. And we're going to do that by combining things like the width with height with positioning elements like floating or flexbox or grids. All of those tools are at our disposal to make it really easy for us to build a beautiful web page that looks just as good if you're on a big computer like this or if you're on a mobile phone that is shrunk down. Right? Any questions? Okay. We also have the ability to set, there are a few special properties that we're going to definitely need as we start playing with responsive design a little bit more. Right? We set a width here of 200 pixels, but we can also set a let's say a min. Let's change this to 400. Right? So we'll say 400 pixels. We can set a min width of 200 pixels. Right? What this will let us do, if we show this off, right? So this is our elements. As we get to this part of the page, right, we'll be able to set things that force it to stay. Right, that allow it to grow gracefully. We would need to use right, so we can say, hey, use as much space as you can. Let's min width. Right, so this now is growing with the content of our elements, but it will only go to a certain height before it stops. Right, so we have all these extra things. So there's a min width and a max width, and when we start getting into responsive attributes with media queries and things, we'll show off how to use those a little bit more appropriately. But just know that those properties also control height and width. Min width, max width, min height, max height. Okay? Borders, we've already I use borders all the time. Borders used to be, and the reason I use borders all the time is because borders were the way that the old version of software development was easy to debug and figure out why things were going wrong. Okay? Right now we have way better tools, like we have this this little computed style explorer that shows us all of our paddings and borders and margins. But generally what I would used to do when I was trying to lay out all of my elements on the page and make sure everything made sense is that I would add a border to everything. I would come in here and say border 1px solid blue, right? So now all of my elements, you can see where their boundaries lie so that I can make sure that, like, hey, this isn't lining up correctly. I'll put a border around it and I will take a look and see, why isn't it lining up? Or if that wasn't even showing up well, I'd make it 2px, right? Now it's very clear what all of my elements and all my boundaries are, because I know that the padding is the white space inside of the border and my margin is the white space outside of my border. So if I can see the border, then I can start to figure out, like, what is going wrong with my elements, right? Now we have other tools at our disposal. Now you probably are only just going to use borders for things like actually stylistically, when you want to, like we did with our card here. Let's turn this off. Right? We added a thin black border around this card. Let's see if we can make this a little bit easier to see. right? So that it makes these cards stand out. They're stylistically distinct, okay? And so the format for calling this border property, this is another one that is a combiner one, right? So border width 2px, border style, right? That's where we're saying, I use solid pretty often, but we also have dotted, we have dashed, right? So if I make this dotted, for example, right? It's kind of hard to see. Let's make this bigger, 6px maybe. Yeah, you can see that it's just a bunch of dots with some space in them. There's also a dashed style, which turns them into little dashes, as you'd expect. What else do we have that's cool? Groove. This is a kind of a neat one. It's kind of hard to see, but it like makes it a little bit inset. What else? Outset. Ridge. Ridge is a cool one. If it shows up. No, it doesn't. But most of the time you're probably going to use solid, or you're going to use dotted or dashed, depending on what you want. Solid. And then the last part of this is border color black. Right? So this says border width 6px, border style solid, border color black, or we can combine that into one single call with the shorthand property and just say border 2px solid black. 6px solid black, if we were trying to recreate those 3 lines. So this shorthand property, there are a whole bunch of these. Font has, we learned about the font earlier, right? Font size, font family. There is a font option where we can put in, 16px italic. Right? You can combine all these properties together. But in general, if you just get used to, for the most part, you're probably just going to always use border 1px solid black, or border one, something solid, some color. The border is one that I almost always, I don't think I've ever used the expanded properties where I'm defining each individual thing. Maybe if I wanted to come in here and say, border bottom color, right? Blue. If I wanted to do something artistic or creative with my colors for gradient purposes or for something stylistic, you can define the default border and then go in and override one, either top, right, bottom, or left. That's an option as well. And then border radius. So border radius is the one that is giving us this beautiful rounded border. Where are we at? So I get, by default, the border is going to follow the fact that this is a box, right? Everything in CSS is a box, but when we put in a border radius, we say border radius, and then we can define these in a bunch of different ways, right? I just put in 10px, I think, right? It gave us kind of a nice curve, but the format for all of these cardinal directions in CSS, if we wanted to do all of this in one line, is top, right, bottom, left. Clockwork from noon back around to noon, right? So if I do 10px here, 0px, 10px, 0px, right? So this is the top value, this is the right value, this is the bottom, and this is the left. If I save this, right, now we've got, let's make it even bigger, 25, right? I've kind of made this this cutesy little curved top, sharp angle up here, curved bottom, sharp angle over here, right? So we can define, if you don't put 4 values in here, if I just put 25, or 25px, excuse me, right, it's going to make all 4 of those values be the same thing. If I do 2 different things in here, 25, this is going to be top and bottom, left and right. It's going to do the same thing we had before. Or I can maybe do 25px and then 25px. Maybe this style looks good, where I've got just the top right is a square, is squared off. There's a whole bunch of flexibility in here that sometimes look pretty cool, depending on whatever type of look and feel you're going for with your website. Right, let's make this white so it's a little easier to see. Right? So we've kind of made this interesting looking style here, and you can imagine if you were really trying to be creative, right? This kind of opens up some interesting opportunities or doors for us to make some interesting looking cards, right? So if we were to right, so we have this border radius right here on the card thing. I can come through here using the cascading effect of CSS, and I can say card And then we can add a second class and we say alternate. And I can just change the border radius property so that instead of the top right, that is the difference, we say this is 25 and this is 0. Okay. And then I can come down here into my CSS. So this is the top card. And then I can say this is alternate. And that's the bottom card, right? So now I've got, these are kind of changing up as we go through these cards, right? That one's different, then that one's different, then that one's different. But all I've had to do is write one new CSS property and add that class, the alternate class, to one of these elements. Oh, here, I got an idea. Top, I'm gonna actually make this 0, px, this 25. This looks cool, right? So it's either the top right is there or the top left is there, right? So if you can imagine, this is like some kind of feed, right? You're like scrolling through your feed. You know, this could be like a chat bubble, right? Or like, oh, let's do that the other way, right? Let's say 25, bottom right, 25, so top, bottom, right? And then let's make this one background color. Oh, let's make this one background color medium turquoise, right? Cool. Background border color medium turquoise. Right? And if we had all of our other colors in here, right? You can kind of see we've I've messed it up. Top right, 25, bottom 0. Now I've kind of created a chat system like you'd see on your phone, where it's like, this is my message, and this is the reply from the other person, right? We did this just with CSS, and obviously we did this kind of on the fly just because I saw it. We'd want to make the entirety of this background have that same color, but this kind of mimics, the native Android or iPhone type of text messaging interface where it's a little bubble, right? So that's the power of borders. You can add a lot of flavor and characters. Think of it as like the texture of your pages with some of these elements. Okay. Any questions about that? We've covered a couple of different interesting things. All right. Next up is background. Right. We've been playing with this. I use it all the time because you always want to have some color behind the scenes, right? So the first thing that you do is background color, right? Background color sets the color of the object, right? So we've done background color, medium turquoise, or you can put in any RGB color that you want, or you can use hex color codes, right? All of the colors can be set with background color. But we have a bunch of other interesting things that we can do with background image. And so let's just, I'm sure that W3 Schools has some good things. So let's say background image. There are a bunch of cool things you can do, right? We put in the URL to the image that we're going to link in the background, right? So in this case, it says paper.gif, and then it says, right? So you can see that it added an image as the background to this element, the body, and it's going to repeat it by default. Okay. There's a whole bunch of other things, right? We can set up 2 backgrounds, right? So this one now has the paper behind the scenes, and then a tree over top of it. If we switch the order around here, we say URL paper.gif, comma, right? Now I think, though these aren't my images, right? The paper is on top, because that was just this big flat blank thing. So the way that they had it before, let the tree be on top, right? So we can do multiple of these. Image tree.gif, comma, paper, right? So now it's going tree, paper, and then there's another set of trees behind the paper that you can't even see. So that's the background image option. And it has a whole bunch of other things. So let's keep looking. Yeah. So we can define, right? So I said by default, when you just put in background image, it's using, it's repeating, right? So we can also use the background repeat property to tell it to repeat or not to repeat. So by default, it is repeating, right? So paper is repeating over and over and over again on down the page. But we told the tree not to repeat. If we turn this back to repeat, Right? That was what's causing it to load on forever. Right? So if for whatever reason you didn't want it to repeat, right, you would put in no repeat. What else can we do? Okay. So this is a pretty common characteristic where you're going to create a hero image like this. Right? You got a big picture on a header. You want it to be like, you want the text to be in front of it. And so they're doing that using a couple of these different background type properties together. So the first they're saying the image is this. They're putting in the picture of the lady. Then they're saying the background position is center. Right? So it's centered on the page. You can see that it remains there regardless of the size. Then they're saying it doesn't repeat. You don't want Jane Doe to be repeating over and over and over again. And if we change this to repeat, you can kind of see what it would. If we ever, I don't even know if I can make this big enough. No, probably not. And then it's saying that the background size is cover, right? So the background size is an interesting property that we need to do to background size, because there's a bunch of different options in here that determine how this works, right? So auto is the default, so it's going to be whatever the size the picture is, that's the size you get, okay? And so if we'd gone back to this lady and we said background size is auto, right? That's the default value. Now, if we if we had it be repeat and we were able to make our window big enough, then So if I drag this all the way over here, you can see that it starts to repeat because that was a really big image to begin with. Gosh, it's gonna take me forever to make my window the right size again. Cool. And that's with the background size, right? So it was covered by default, which means it's just gonna fit in this window as best as it can, and if the window has to grow or shrink, that's fine. What else? Where was it? There's also a contain. It's going to resize the background image to make sure the image is fully visible. So that's kind of the opposite of cover. Where's that? Cover, right? So that was cover. Contain, right? It's going to make sure that we can see, right? So now you can see the no repeat thing. This was a really wide image. You want to generally pick really wide images if you're going to use them for this kind of header. But you can see that the dimensions of the image were too big for this page. So now it's starting to repeat, right? I would have had to resize my thing to go in there. So generally with this kind of thing, when you're wanting to play with it, right, you're going to do no repeat, cover, and it will look pretty good most of the time. Those three things combined with background image generally are what you want to do. So we were talking a little bit earlier about background color and why you would want to use RGBA, right? So you might want to come in here and say RGBA. Let's make this 000, so it's black by default, and then we'll say 0.5. So this is the kind of thing that you can do. Let's make this 1 and see what that looks like. 0. Maybe the image is over top of it. Yeah, so that's probably how they have it structured. So we probably need to do body. Let's do this one. Yeah, they, if we wanted to make this kind of, I'm sure you guys have seen before where the image itself will be a little bit light, and there'll be like some kind of cover. We'd have to put some elements in here to allow us to do that. But you can do all that with a combination of these background elements. Cool. What else? So the W3 schools, when you're wanting to do background, like their background size property page is an excellent resource because it's got a whole bunch of real world examples of how you can implement some of these things that are a little bit finicky. You have to try a bunch of iterations. I never remember all of these different background types, and so I will reference this anytime I need to do this because there's just so many different silly incantations, right? Any questions about the background image property or positioning, any of that? Where would you go if you need to look up how to do these things?
W3 schools.
Yeah, it's a perfect place. this. Or, when in doubt, you can always Google it. Right? So you can Google, hit Control S, Google. We can say background size, right? And most of the time, it's going to either take you to Mozilla as the top resource or W3 Schools. So a good Google search will almost always get you out of trouble. And Mozilla, they have a really good, sometimes Mozilla's references are a little better than W3 Schools. Sometimes they're a little bit more technical and jargony. So, it just depends. But they give you a couple really cool options here that show you what these different things do. So, in this case, Mozilla's is pretty decent. Cool. All right, it is 6:43. We still have a couple more things to go over. So let's take another quick break. Let's come back at 7, and then maybe we'll have a little bit of time for practice as well. Cool. Let me start the recording. So we have two types of gradients. The first is a linear gradient, which means it goes in a line from either one direction to another. It could be left to right, top to bottom, one corner to another corner. It could be based on like an angle of degrees. And these are like a pretty traditional, this is like the default type of gradient. And so W3 Schools has a bunch of really good examples of this, and so we'll just kind of show this off. So this would be a top to bottom gradient, right? This is the default. So if we say, hey, the background image is a linear gradient, and that's a function. The first parameter is the direction. Then it has the first color, the second color, on to as many colors as you want, right? So if we wanted to implement this on our page, right? Instead of this purple background color, let's see if we can make one real quick. It's kind of cool. Yeah, right here. So we'll do background image, and instead of just saying medium purple, we'll say linear gradient, and we'll say top to bottom, right? So that's the default. Or we could just, and then we'll say medium purple, and we'll say red, right? So if we, picked the wrong, never remember these stupid direction names, so we'll say top to bottom. Well, we don't have to put it in for top to bottom, so we can just put in linear gradient just by itself. All right, where was that? Right here, right? So, what element did I put this on? Oh, I put it on the nav element. What a big dummy. Put it on the body, right? So you can see now that it goes from purple at the top to red at the bottom. And we could have put in more steps in here, right? We could put in green, right? So it's going to go from purple to green to red, right? I don't know why you'd want to do those colors. That's pretty nasty. We could put a blue in here, right? Purple to blue to green to red. So any number of steps from there to there. We can also make it go in a different direction, right? We could do to right, right? So we can say going from left to right. So we can say to right. Right? And so now you see that gradient goes this way, right? From left to right. We can also do, as you might imagine, to left, right? So it's going to go purple to red. Those are linear gradients. We can also have it be directed to bottom right, right? So to bottom right, or to bottom left. Both will work. So if we look at our page now, you can see it goes from the top left corner of the screen to the bottom right of our page. Now, all of these things are there as options for us to add some texture and flavor. Obviously, I picked a really obscene example of colors, like you should probably never in any kind of real-world scenario pick something this garish. But if you're picking something subtle, right? If you've got something that goes from like a light blue to a white, or some kind of color that complements the other colors in your design, this is a good way to just inject some flow, or to inject some texture and some feeling, right? And this is a really powerful way to do that. There's another type of gradient, which is a radial gradient, right? And so that's going to be circular, right? So instead of on a line, this is going to go from all directions in, right? So we can say radial gradient. And it doesn't take a direction, but what we can do here is still takes multiple colors. And so if we look at this now, the center of our page is a purple, and then it goes like blue, green, red on outward, right? And that one's really the easiest to use. We can also put percentages in here, so we can choose, at what what is our stopping point, right? So for each of these colors, we can say medium purple, and let's put this at like 40%, right? So here now our medium purple takes up more of this thing, right? So these numbers have to add up to 100, obviously, but we could do 40, 20, 10, 4, 2, 6, 7, and we can do 30 for the rest, right? So we can structure our gradients. Oh man, that's really sharp. We can structure our gradients any sort of way we want. Now, I have a hard time remembering all these rules, like what does the gradient look like. So almost always, and I would encourage you to do this as well, there are a bunch of really good tools on the internet. This one is at cssgradient.io. Okay, and I'm sure if you search Google, you could probably search for like CSS gradient builder, and you're gonna get something like this, and it's gonna give you sliders. You can choose what type of gradient you're doing, so it makes it really easy to design these without having to like know and type in those esoteric commands, right? So if I wanted to use a gradient for something, I'm going to use a tool like this, and you can just click here and add as many color stops as you wanted, right? So if you wanted to make it, a very smooth gradient that goes from this to that, right? Adding more color stops in here will let you do that, right? And you can choose, how dark or how light you want this to be, right? So tools like this are amazing at helping you design that type of thing. I'm going to be honest, like most of the time when I'm using a gradient, it's as the main background color to the page. And I'm going to make it as subtle as possible, going from like a darker color up top to a lighter color in the bottom, or maybe vice versa, depending on the type of mood and aesthetic I'm going for on the page. And then I'm going to have all of my cards or all of my content areas just be like regular white or some kind of light color so that it's very readable and easy to read. But if I'm building a blog or I'm building something like that, I'm going to use a gradient just to give it a bit of a texture so that in between or behind those cards, inside the white space that we have as the margin between our elements, we've got something kind of visually interesting back there just to give it a little pop, give it a little pizzazz. And the cool thing about this CSS gradient tool, this one specifically, is that when you get your gradient looking like you want it to, it's going to give you the full CSS that we need to just copy and paste this into our page. So if I was to, let's get this looking really good, right? That's good enough. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, and if I just come in here, right, this was our current gradient, which was terrible, and I'm just going to come in here and plop that in, right? Background linear gradient with all those steps, and if I save this now, yeah, there we go. Already our page kind of looks a little bit better, right? Even if we just ignore some of these red boxes and stuff we were showing off earlier. Any questions about gradients? This is like the most advanced CSS thing that I will do on any kind of regular basis, in terms of like color or making things spicy looking. For the most part, whites and dark colors, like either pure white or some kind of off-white as a background, is a really strong choice, or some kind of dark background color is a really strong choice. You're going to see that as your predominantly, those are your choices. But when I want to make something really special, something for me, right, I might use something like this, especially on marketing pages where you really want it to stand out from your competition. Any questions? Go ahead, Olivia.
I don't really have a question on gradients, but it's more like, is CSS, do you do hovers in that too?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, I think tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
It's pseudo selectors. Maybe that's Wednesday. We'll definitely talk about it here a little bit. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, we'll talk about it. There's a whole bunch of events that we can tap into with JavaScript, and so like the default one, right? Normally you're going to want to style your links like color. Let's give it a bright color we can see, orange, maybe. Yeah, good. Let's look. Do we have a link on this page even? Oh yeah, perfect. Right here. So right now, because we've overridden this with CSS, we said every anchor tag has this color. CSS gives us the ability to come in here and say a:hover color. Let's make it pale violet red, I guess. Right. So now when I mouse over it, it changes to a different color. And maybe we want to make it so when we hover over it, it makes the font weight bold, maybe. Right, so it makes it a little bigger. I don't know. I would fiddle with this until I got it happy. But we definitely have some techniques available to us in CSS that let us do some really cool things when the user is interacting with the page stylistically. Good question, and we'll cover that. I mean, we got several more days of CSS ahead of us still. Yeah, I think all of next week is still CSS. Any other questions? All right, it is 7:10. That kind of concludes the introduction to CSS. What I think would be fun to do maybe for the next 20 minutes is just to go into the portfolio projects you guys have been working on, the ones that we've been playing with and showing off for the last couple days, and just start to use background color and font and maybe borders on things, just to start adding a little bit of color, a little bit of personality. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we're almost done, so let's work on this until 7:40 and then come back and just show off what we've done, okay? So 7:40 we'll come back and we'll do a little show and tell with just some of these things we've played with today.